This is my, is this 5? I can't remember. Is this 5?
5 or 6? I'm not sure. 5,
I think it's 5. Yeah, this is my fifth lecture in the series on determinism. As my previous lecture was basically an introduction to Ayn Rand's thoughts and what I think she successfully did in reconciling this historic dichotomy. The Pythagorean soul-body dichotomy. On one side of the world we had the cosmic consciousness, the mystical determinists, and these specific players in world history. And on the other side, an impotent consciousness, mechanistic materialist determinist, and that's basically represented by these players. Ultimately, man is divided between one or the other. Ultimately, again, dazzling you with my PowerPoint skills. This is what I think sort of represents what I think she did. Man is a consciousness. His consciousness has an identity. That consciousness is the faculty for perceiving existence. Existence is identity. Consciousness is identification. Existence is not a massive billiard ball construct, which of course answers the mechanistic materialists. There is no such thing as causeless action, answering of course the indeterminists. Action is the action of entities acting in accordance to their nature. Man's consciousness has identity. Man's actions are volitional, and volition is axiomatic. Man chooses his causation based on his values. Each man is a prime mover. Free will is axiomatic to human existence. This is, of course, the barest summation of her thoughts, and I recommend reading her books referenced earlier for a thorough evaluation of her ideas. Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology and Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand. By all means, read those at your own pursuit. But having given a metaphysical answer to determinism, I want to spend some time addressing common arguments with New Calvinists. It's not really possible to dissect every argument you will get out of New Calvinists. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick a sample. I think what are the high points, the kinds of things you will typically encounter. And once I do, I think you'll get the sample and you'll be able to apply the same methods to pretty much anything they come at you with will actually follow along the same lines. Now remember, philosophical statements are hierarchical. We start with metaphysical. Everything above that rests on the metaphysical premise. We have epistemology. Epistemology, my triangle is big because I'm trying to illustrate. Epistemology is the broadest study in philosophy. Then your epistemology will determine your ethics, and your ethics will determine your politics. Said another way, metaphysics is existence, consciousness, identity. Epistemology is the means and validation of knowledge. Ethics is action in accord with good. And politics is sanctioned force. Keep this framework in mind as we talk about these rebuttals. I'm going to try to inspire you to start thinking like a philosopher. Now, historically, the first objections to determinism started with a rejection, the problem, the conflict between moral action and determined outcome, right? You remember that, right? Okay. I want you to look at this. Here's ethics, right? Where is determinism on this progression?
Where is it, or where would it?
Where is it? If you're determined, where is it? Where are we in the philosophical progression? If you are morally depraved, if you are depraved as such, where are you?
Metaphysics.
Metaphysics. I want you to notice why they had so much trouble rebutting determinism by starting with an objection of ethics. Ethics is not foundational. Metaphysics is foundational. So making an appeal to moral action as the need for free will, it can't work. Do you understand? See it? See the flaw? So when Augustine says that man is infused with original sin, the starting point of his argument is a metaphysical argument. So any action towards good, and this is why the arguing determinism from ethics is doomed to fail. The metaphysical foundation, the metaphysical is the foundation here. Ethics is a consequence of your metaphysical premise. So here's the problem. Pelagius was right. Augustine's metaphysic must lead to moral laxity. But since Pelagius had no philosophical answer to Augustine's arbitrary assertion, specifically original sin, he could not defeat Augustine's formulation. Because he could not answer the metaphysical premise, he could not ultimately answer the philosophical structure. So it is my observation that the Pelagian fight was lost before Pelagius wrote his first words.
John, can I ask a question?
Sure.
This structure that you've got here,
Yeah.
how long has that been the understanding of philosophy?
I don't even think I know the answer to that question.
Because I guess the reason I'm asking, because we know why Pelagius wasn't able to refute the argument, because we can see this. And obviously, of course, going along with that, had he known this, or had he understood that, he could have probably possibly framed a better argument. So when would this understanding of philosophy have come about? I guess, do you see where I'm kind of going?
I do, and I think I'm going to reiterate what I just said. I don't know. I think this has always been implicitly understood.
Right. But
by Western thinkers?
Who would have first, I guess, expressed it like this? I mean, I'm not necessarily like a who, but more or less a time frame, perhaps. I don't really quite know what I'm asking, but I guess
I'm thinking.
When would this understanding of philosophy have come about, whereby then people could accurately frame their arguments?
Actually, I think I understand what you're asking. I don't think I have an answer, a specific date. I want to say, as a general rule, I think Plato understood this. I certainly think Aristotle understood it, because Aristotle's what we have of Aristotle's work, he spends an enormous amount of time with his metaphysics.
He might not have necessarily defined it this way.
He might. This is just a visual representation, right. And effectively mine, like I said, dazzling you with my PowerPoint skills. But
and I understand the graphic, but the actual concepts of metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, politics, and
so this has been, these categories in philosophy have been pretty much from almost its inception. Okay. As a formal statement like this, I don't know that I have an answer. Okay. And in a modest defense of Pelagius, I know I'm saddling him with a failure that he really doesn't have the ability to satisfy. During his time frame, could he have challenged Aristotle? Probably not. His best hope would have been to have understood Aristotle's work. Aristotle's work, of course, starts with the law of identity. The law of identity establishes the identity of entities. And so he could have, on some level, he'd have to have been a really sharp man to try to extract a successful rebuttal to Augustine's Platonism with Aristotle as his source. And that probably would have been well beyond him, because I don't think that's the kind of thinker he was. He gets, most of the people that I read as I was preparing for this called him a practical theologian, and I think that's probably true. And typically a practical theologian, I think you and he would have gotten along very well. Here's the spiritual principle. Now, how do you live this kind of mindset? And he was very infectious to his audience. So, and one of the criticisms, or one of the challenges that was often addressed was that Pelagius was not a systematic theologian, and as such, he did not have the same argumentative skills as Augustine. And they attributed his failure to persuade based on this lack of skill. Ultimately, I think that that's a layer too high. His lack of skill is a failure to grasp the nature of Augustine's argument. So, clear as mud. Got it? Okay. So, as I was saying, the Pelagius fight was lost before Pelagius wrote his first words. Augustine had the advantage of Plato's full formulation and the power of the state to enforce his every theological whim. That is not a fair fight by any far stretch of mine. So now let me address the meaning of new Calvinist determinism. Far too many people let new Calvinists off the hook for their metaphysical assertion. This is another quote. I don't think you've seen this one before. My mind's a little bit of a blur at the moment. I can't remember which quotes you've seen up till now, but I don't think you have. This is another quote from the exact same John MacArthur speech to the T4G conference in 2008. He said, "They may have sentimental affection for the God of their own making, but they actually hate and cannot love the true God. And when you tell them there is nothing in them that is good and nothing in them that can please God, they can do no human good. They can do human good. They can do human philanthropy in the sight of men. They can do things that are moral and noble, but they can do nothing that ascends to satisfy God's requirement for a relationship with Him and for entrance into heaven, and they resent it." Here is what I want you to notice. Under the Calvinist construct, there is no such thing as human good. The moment man is metaphysically corrupt, there is no such thing as a metaphysical corruption taking good action. By definition, man cannot take action towards God, because any action towards God is good. And any action towards God requires volition. Remember my original presentation. So to parse out a good that is uniquely human and then say that it has no metaphysical value is to undercut the very concept of good at the root. And I bolded this trying to point out that he's making a concession to human good right here. And he's trying to suggest that there is somehow two kinds of good in action.
Absolutely.
And this is utterly false. It's not possible under the New Calvinist construct. Under the construct, man cannot take action towards a value. Period. So by definition, there is no such thing as philanthropy. Philanthropy translates the love of humanity. By Calvinist definition, man's only love is his love for himself. It is a love so corrupt that he is a festering wound of evil. And the eyes of other men cannot perceive any good because they are the exact same corrupting, festering sore of evil looking only at themselves. There is no such thing as philanthropy under the Neo-Calvinist position. What is the first sentence of John MacArthur's comment? They may have sentimental affection for the God of their own making, but they actually hate and cannot love the true God. Under the Augustinian, Luther, Calvin axis of evil, this is all that can be said. The comments about human good betrays the theological inconsistency rampant throughout the New Calvinist position. This is the only true statement in what he said, if they're consistent with their doctrine. That's it. When you encounter this kind of thing, the first thing you must do is stop the conversation if they amend. Anytime they do this stuff, you must resist their efforts.
So basically, if you can somehow get them to concede that notion that well, yeah, men does good things, then basically you've got them in a contradiction.
Absolutely. The moment they say man can do some good, I don't care how they qualify that concept, they are betraying the very orthodoxy they insist they advance. This is another thing that that will often be brought up in a discussion with a Calvinist. Calvinists often portray God's sovereignty as the base of Christian hope. The loose logic goes like this: God is in control of everything. Whatever happens is for your good. Therefore, you should have hope because God is acting for your good. Here's the dirty little secret. There is no such thing as your good. The Calvinist construct equals God acts for his good and his good alone. All of God's actions are for his good, his glory, and his purpose. There is no such thing as human good. His self-good, his self-glory, his self-praise is all that matters. Since his good is supported, sustained, or achieved by human destruction, whatever is happening to you has nothing to do with you. I'm going to say that again. Since his good is supported, sustained, and achieved by human destruction, whatever is happening to you has nothing to do with you. The doctrine of God's sovereignty is really the doctrine of human destruction because it is the destruction of values as such. And this is why I say Christianity is a cult of death. Here's a real-world application for what I'm talking about. And this is going to hit close to home. I intend it to. Abortions. Christians have no right to object. By definition, if abortion is the law of the land, under the Calvinist determinism, God intends for those babies to be destroyed. Their destruction brings him glory. Every time Planned Parenthood harvests a heart or a liver out of an unviable mass of tissue, it is because God is giving himself praise. All hail the Calvinist God. All hail the Christian cult of death. In the greatest manifestation of Christian schizophrenia, I want to reiterate something that actually came up yesterday when we were discussing this theological inconsistency. I'll move on from, I already made my comment about abortion, but I want to now move on to the unsaved. And this is another manifestation of their theological schizophrenia. The example of unbelieving children stumble because fighting in Christianity. I'm going to reiterate, there is no human agency in salvation. No human agency means no human action can account for salvation or damnation. Both are products of God's intent. You must refuse to give New Calvinists a pass when they trot out this madness in a conversation. I'm going to give you some self-plagiarism. This is a section out of Blight in the Vineyard, a book I wrote for those of you who don't know. Again, I will make this very personal. I often hear, and since the subject of my book dealt with Sovereign Grace Ministries, this next acronym, SGM, is in reference to Sovereign Grace Ministries. I often hear SGM defenders say that open, frank criticism turns unbelieving children away from God and his gospel. So please, suck up the offense and let sweetness and light shine through, so that children can decide which way to go. I am always amazed the church members can make this declaration with a straight face. They don't actually listen to what comes out of the pulpit, or they are listening and parroting a glaring inconsistency. Unconditional election is quite plain. There is no such thing as children deciding to choose God. There is no intellectual process that will lead them to the right answers. The current state of their soul is appointed. If they do not believe, God has not granted them grace to repent. It won't matter whether they hear a steady diet of perfect doctrine, theological sunshine, and interpersonal sweetness. Their unbelieverness has nothing to do with the controversy openly discussed in this book or on a blog site or in a bar. Your kids are going to where it's warm and smoky because God wants it that way. If your son and daughter is acting like an unbeliever,
He's singing hallelujah in heaven when they do.
when they do, right? If your son or daughter is acting like an unbeliever, if your son or daughter is failing to display the fruits of salvation, it is because God wants to send him to Guantanamo Bay where he can waterboard him in fire forever. It brings him glory to torture your children for eternity. All hail the Calvinist God. All hail the important people. All hail the church, the Christian cult of death. Hey, it's your doctrine, not mine. I want to use these next two examples to illustrate how neo-Calvinist preachers manipulate philosophic concepts to advance their doctrine. John MacArthur, T4G, 2008, this is the exact same source I've been using the entire conference. It doesn't sit well with the sinner because one of the dominant features of universal human fallenness is deception about one's true condition. Based on the dominating reality of human pride, the sinner is unwilling to see himself in his true condition and is convinced to one degree or another of his goodness. People will deny that they are evil, that there are sins in their lives, but they do not see the evil in their good, and they do not see the evil in their religion. They will deny that they are incurably evil, hostile to God, and utterly incapable of any true good. This because they are self-deceived. There are people who even invoke the name of the true God, people who invoke the name of Jesus, people who claim to love God, while in reality they hate the true God. They may have sentimental affection for the God of their own making, but they actually hate and cannot love the true God. Now, obviously, here we see John MacArthur reiterating the very point that I made earlier. They will deny they are incurably evil, hostile to God, utterly inescapable of any true good. This is because they are self-deceived. They are evil, evil, evil. He is conceding the very metaphysical premise I insist that Calvinism presents. But here's what I want you to notice. The comment, because they are self-deceived, and this last one, they actually hate and cannot love the true God. So let me address the second one first. As a general practice, get in the habit, anytime you hear the word love, immediately switch to values. The moment you hear love, love is the emotional manifestation of values. And the reason I want you to do this is because values are contextual. For the very same reason that when you say the word love gets ambiguous when you say, I love peanut butter and I love my wife. When you say I value peanut butter and I value my wife, the context is apparent to the value. And also, the reason I want you to do that, because I want you to think like philosophers. Because when we're discussing, particularly when we're discussing the issue of New Calvinists, they're making value statements based on a very specific philosophical formulation. Notice where values is in this progression. You see it? Right here. We start with perception, volition, reason, values. Man makes his choices. He chooses his causes based on his values. Love is a branch off of values. Now, I want you to notice it is impossible to love something without volition. Notice how these rest, how this progression, this conceptual progression works. You can't value something if you don't have a reason for valuing it. You can't have reason unless you have volition. The process of validation requires all rests here, and what you're validating is this relationship, the relationship between your volition, your reason, and your values. Do you see it? Love is predicated on values. Value is predicated on reason. And reason is predicated on volition. And volition is validated on perception. So when you hear John MacArthur talk about loving God, when he says you can't do it, he's really saying you can't do something that requires action to do. It is possible for man to deceive himself. Now, this is the B part of his comment above. This is because they are self-deceived. Let's talk about self-deception here for a minute. Remember his previous statements. They will deny that they are incurably evil, hostile to God, and utterly incapable of any true good. By definition, this creature that he's describing has no metaphysical ability to act towards God, which means man cannot act to identify truth, which means under the Calvinist worldview, there is no such thing as self-deception, because man is an inert metaphysical lump of incurable evil. Only a consciousness of a certain kind that acquires knowledge by a certain means, with the freedom to focus or evade the facts of reality, can be said to self-deceive. So at its root, self-deception, the very self-deception he insists man has, requires volition at the root of his actions. So you can't have both. You can't have self-deception and the determinist worldview. Now this is similar issue with R.C. Sproul. I quoted this very same article yesterday about R.C. Sproul, Augustine, and Pelagius. The very tail end of the quote that I used yesterday said this: the seminal thought of Pelagius survives today not as a trace or a tangential influence, but is pervasive in the modern church. Indeed, the modern church is held captive by it. First, remember, under the Calvinist hard determinist worldview, there is no such thing as human autonomy. There is no such thing as independent action. God appoints all actions for his own ineffable purpose. The question that leaps to mind is, how can the church be held captive by an idea that God did not appoint? And the answer is it can't. By definition, whatever captivity, and I use that word loosely, the church endures it because God intends the church to be captive. This would be the theologically consistent position. The ideas perpetrating the captivity are merely the scapegoat blame for God's intention. That's if we were theologically consistent. But here's really what Sproul is saying. His real point is to imply that metaphysical human inability is really the root of freedom. I'm going to say that again. Sproul's real point is to imply that metaphysical human inability is really the root of freedom. Where did we hear that before? Remember yesterday? Remember Kant's take on determinism? Man must destroy everything he values in service to duty. Even though it looks like man is determined towards self-destruction, the nominal perspective of freedom is found in self-destruction. It's exactly the same fundamental premise. So here's what Sproul is really saying. Here is what captivity, if we're going to discuss captivity, here's the conceptual progression to actually get to liberty. To actually have captivity, you have violence inserted at action and liberty. Do you see it? This is what produces captivity. But captivity presumes freedom, volition, reason, values, and action. He is manipulating the concept, captivity, to imply something in context it cannot mean. Here, R.C. Sproul is duplicating the same argument of fallacy as John MacArthur. Ayn Rand called this the stolen concept fallacy. It is the fallacy of using a concept while denying the validity of its genetic roots of an earlier concept on which it logically depends. So here's the genetic roots. Before we can get to captivity, the insertion of violence, the arresting of free action, we had to presume all of these things were true. And so if the church is held captive, a determinist worldview, that is fundamentally impossible. And this ultimately is my point. This is how they consistently manipulate the definition of words in an effort to consistently advance their doctrinal perspective. If you start thinking in these terms, how concepts are hierarchical and what they logically rest on, it becomes trivially simple to see what they're manipulating. Once you begin to identify this progression, understanding that at the root of all human action is volition, every time they tell you that you're deceived, you can say, you can't possibly represent that to me. Under your doctrine, I cannot be deceived. By definition, I have no choice in what I do or what I think. Only a consciousness of a certain kind acquiring knowledge by a certain means that can err can really be deceived. But that is also a choice. Okay, this next one I'm going to call the argument to omnipotence. The argument goes like this. Because man can't fly, or because he can't walk through walls, or because he can't pick his parents, man is obviously determined by God. The logic boils down to, because man can't do everything, he must not be able to do anything. Because man cannot fulfill his every whim, he must be subject to forces that dictate his actions. Because man is not metaphysically divine, he must be metaphysically impotent. I'm going to make this is actually very simple to refute. Because ultimately what they've done is they've set up whim fulfillment as the metaphysical standard. Because you can't fulfill your every whim, you must necessarily be determined. And this is ultimately a false choice.
There's no in-between on anything.
Well, that's
It's
their
either
premise.
or.
As they frame that part of the argument, yes, it's either
Right.
or.
In a logical construct, all you need is one instance of that not being true to disprove it.
Well, ultimately, the answer to the question metaphysically is that man's consciousness has identity, and man's consciousness, reality, what they're trying to do is to get to rewrite reality as such.
Right.
If reality were something fundamentally different, man would be free. What you ultimately say is, no, this is reality, man is finite, and there are limitations, but the nature of limitations doesn't specifically render him inert. That's the fundamental fallacy. So they erect this false standard, effectively omniscience. If man were omniscient, then he would not be determined. This is the false choice that they're presenting. Does that make sense? Okay.
But again, a limited knowledge of the audience is assumed. With MacArthur's statement, because man is prideful, he can't see the evil in his own good works. He can't see his total inability and worthlessness.
Well, by
But-
definition, if his premise is true, of course he can.
Right. But then, what do you do with radical environmentalism who don't even profess to be Christians, who say that man indeed should annihilate himself in order to save creation?
It's the same.
That's pretty humble and I don't see any human pride in that at all. We're worthless.
We're worthless.
Same philosophy.
Yeah, what you were
Same
going to say.
philosophy.
It's exactly the same.
Man's
Right.
worthless, and man can only do evil. Man can only be a blight
Right.
upon, he can only be an affront to anything good. If that good is God, whether that good is the state, whether that good is the workers, whether that good is
Right.
the environment, man's existence is the problem.
Correct. It's exactly right. It's exactly the same thought. Okay, that sums up my specific rebuttals of handling the arguments, the kind of arguments that you'll encounter when dealing with New Calvinists, determinists in general. Go ahead.
The one thing that I draw from this is that where we err is allowing New Calvinists to engage us in any kind of conversation without interrupting them on every sentence because of the foundational premise of what they believe.
Yes, exactly right.
But what we do is we sit and let them talk, okay, and basically they use a totally different view of reality in order to draw people into their philosophy. They're allowed to use a contrary
Yes, they are.
reality in order to engage people.
Correct.
And that's where we got to stop.
All right. Here are my closing thoughts on this subject. After all of the overview of the determinist perspective throughout history and the rebuttals that I've offered, here's what I don't want you to lose sight of. I started out this entire conference by pointing out that determinism touches every element of the five points of tyranny. It is a staple of everything we've talked about up till now: universal guilt, dictated good, incompetent masses, collective conformity, and the abolition of ambition. And this is what I want to say emphatically. The only reason to advance the doctrine of determinism, the only reason, is as a foundation for tyrannical government. That is the only reason. If determinism is true, there's no need to advance any ideas, by definition, because consciousness, the content of your consciousness, is automatic. But since we all know that that's absolutely 100% not true, the need to advance the doctrine of determinism has one political function, and that is ultimately to establish some who rule over others. And this goes to Paul's endless drumbeat on the issue of class, on a class society. Everything revolves around a select group of men who have been appointed by whatever the determinist force is to be in charge of all other men. A select group always assumes that they are the ones who have been predestined to preside over God's will or the greater good or the soon-to-arrive utopia. I want to give you guys a second. Can you read that? Can you read that here?
Mm-hmm.
Good. I want to give you guys, because when I'm talking, you guys are usually focusing on my voice, but I want you to actually give you a minute to read this. I hope you can see this online, so I will read it, but take a minute and just read what he said. This is the introduction to his sermon at T4G in 2008. This is John MacArthur, his introduction, T4G 2008. This is everything that I have been, every quote that I've taken, this is the introduction to everything he said after. The subject that I have this morning, and by the way, before we dig into that a little bit, it's just always an honor to minister with these men. And it's a privilege and a joy to be here at this conference and to minister to you. Obviously, you are the most important people in the world. The most important people in the world preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. They don't run nations. They don't run institutions. They don't run corporations. They don't run universities. They make an eternal difference. They are a savor of life to life and death to death. And who is adequate for such things except one called to minister the gospel? So I know who I am talking to. A more important group than kings and princes and presidents and emperors and prime ministers and all others. It is therefore critically incumbent upon us that we understand the nature of our message, that we understand the foundations of our gospel. And that's what kind of prompted me to want to talk to you about the subject of total depravity, unwilling and unable as a theme, a gospel theme. I do not understand how a man entirely committed to the Reformed construct can let these words come out of his mouth. I find this beyond mystifying. That he can ascribe to himself and to all others who agree with him the most important people on the planet. How is this hard to understand? There is no agency in God's plan. No human agency in God's plan. How is that hard to understand? How in the world does he get to say they are savors, they make an eternal difference? How can he say this? How is that possible? They're a savor of life to life and death to death. Frankly, what does that mean?
I can tell you what it means.
Is it what? Paul, tell me. I want to know what that means.
That means what Susan taught about Jonathan Edwards. Pastors, when they preach, the effect of their preaching is either going to glorify God by life, or God is going to be glorified by the salvation of men, or he's going to be glorified more and more by the death of men. That's what that is.
Okay, but how are they a savor of anything?
Because it's a sweet savor to God.
Is that savor as in aroma?
Taste, aroma.
Yeah.
That's what that word is?
Yeah, it speaks of God's savor.
It's supposed to be savor.
Savor.
Well, okay.
Okay, so
But maybe the transcript is wrong. I saw that meaning, that's not what I thought that meant. Savor.
Yeah. The person who transcribed it didn't know what they were talking.
Right.
Okay, then I misunderstood because but it still does actually.
That should be SAVOR, and the verse they use in the Book of Revelation is the aroma of the damned is
coming up to God's nostrils.
Coming up to God as a sweet savor forever, or something like that. Okay.
All right.
So that's what they mean. It's this whole business about the predeterminist God being glorified by both salvation and damnation of men, and either way, it's a savor to him, and the savor that's being spoken of there is God's pleasure. That's what he's talking about.
So as they preach,
right?
As they preach, those who are moved by the message to, I mean, if that's even possible, I can't even use the words because it's self-contradictory. Those who are saved as a result of hearing the message.
There's nothing rational.
Is God is glorified in that, in as much as those who are sentenced to damnation because of the message.
Let me put it this way. They preach evangelism. The purpose of evangelism is God's glory.
Okay, yeah, we got that.
Okay? The purpose of evangelism is God's glory. And basically, none of the outcome is up to you. You just preach the gospel and watch the results, because whatever the results are, God is glorified by that. And if you go back and examine carefully the Facebook conversation we had with Dan sometime back, that's exactly what he said, right?
Well, yeah, and even what you just said there, the results there are no results. It is what it is because God's already determined it.
Well,
so there really are no results.
The fact that he predetermined it is beside the point. By God is glorified before men and the angels by the results. Now, the thing of it is, you got to believe that your inkling to go out in evangelism is also predetermined by God.
The results are.
Well, okay.
Either way, it's
Now, what I'm saying here is I take from direct readings of what these people say.
Okay.
Okay?
So everything that they say in and of itself is an outright contradiction. Every single statement that he's made there is a contradiction by definition according to their theology.
Logically, and, if I may,
As soon as they appeal to themselves doing anything, they've contradicted their own doctrine. The whole thing's meaningless.
That's why I'm standing up here mostly speechless, because I'm like, for real? How can you ever ascribe to yourself importance? How? How can you claim for yourself importance under this body of doctrine? Paul's going to read something here for us.
are you ready for this?
Yeah, go ahead.
The Tower of Babel, Genesis 11. Okay? Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had a brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the earth." And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, "Behold," listen carefully, "behold, they are one people, and they have all one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them." Do you see the contradiction there? God intervenes here because he's saying that man has almost unlimited ability. Okay? And if we don't confuse the language, what they'll be able to do as one group is pretty much unlimited and stuff we don't want them doing. So I'm going to intervene. Okay? You have God here saying that man is quite capable. No? Okay? As opposed to total depravity, unwilling and unable. Okay? And what he called later on in the sermon, total inability.
Yes.
Total inability. Okay, so we have a God, and you could go on and on and on. We have a God. It's perfectly all right that we choose ice cream flavor, the color of our car. We can choose anything, our wives. We can choose anything and everything in our lives. But the one thing God deprives us of an ability to choose is Him.
Well, I think there is a true irony in the profound conceit, is that he insists, against the very essence of his doctrine, that the men he is talking to are important.
Right.
While trivializing the very people that made it possible for him to actually get to the conference. I'd bet money that the airplane he flew on was owned by a corporation. And the baggage handlers were employed by a corporation. And his rental car company was a corporation. And the plexiglass podium holding up his Bible was manufactured by a corporation. And yet, somehow, the life pursuit of these people providing goods and services for compensation by other people who agree that their goods and services have value is somehow beneath real consideration.
Not to mention the people that go to his church that pay his salary.
Yeah, the people that go to his church, that pay his salary, that actually go out and do meaningful work so he can stand up behind a plexiglass podium and tell them how trivial they really are. And, just one last
comment. If this is true, pray tell, why does the laity go out and work like dogs to pay the salary of a man who sees them in this way?
I feel like a soccer player.
That is not insanity.
I feel like a soccer player standing on the field looking for a foul with somebody giving me a yellow card. I'm like this all the time. Yeah, exactly. How do you, as a layperson who goes out and busts your butt at a real job, 40, 60, whatever hours a week, so you can make money to give this man 10%, to turn around and tell you how truly irrelevant your job is? Are you serious? You tolerate this. And here's the other thing that I think is just part of this madness. I am 99% sure that SGM is a corporation. And I would bet that every preacher up on that stage, and I have no idea who was there, but I would bet every preacher up on that stage holds their ministry as a legal corporate entity.
Helen, I want to add one more thing. Let's think about another thing. If you want to be one of these men that he's talking about, if you want to be, hey, that sounds pretty good. The almighty John MacArthur sees pastors in this way as the most important people on the earth. So, sir, do you want to be one of those men? Yes. Then all you got to do is have enough money to go to his seminary and get a master's degree in their orthodoxy.
Well, wait a minute.
That's all it takes.
Wait a minute. Didn't he say that they don't run universities? Yeah, they don't run nations. They don't run institutions. They don't run corporations, and they don't run universities. Are you telling me that John MacArthur has a seminary in his ministry?
Right. Oh, yeah.
I'm pointing out the irony, but the entire disconnect between what this man is saying and what this represents.
It's insanity.
All right, but whatever. My blood pressure's starting to spike on this. So, see, far too many people are on the sidelines. And you're tolerating this madness coming out of the New Calvinist pulpits. Far too many people act as if they are this is all merely academic quibbling. Far too many people sit around and wring their hands. Far too many people wail and moan on blogs giving cyber hugs. Far too many people continue to appease those people advancing evil doctrines. And this is why I have decided to call you out. Now, it's a little hard for me to look at the people actually watching here because I know they're doing the work. So on some level, pretty much on every level, I'm talking to people online. You have got to stop appeasing these people. You have got to stop apologizing for your own achievements. You've got to stop hiding your own virtues. You've got to stop deriding your own values. And you've got to stop debasing your own character. When they ask you to do these things in the name of righteousness, it has one purpose: to appease the original sin preachers, and you have one ultimate goal, and that is to rule the world in the name of God. Do not doubt me here. Their purpose and their intent is to take over government exactly like the Puritans did in Puritan England. But here's the dirty little secret that they never want you to understand. These men can only survive in a climate of appeasement and rational subordination. I will give an example of a man that I happen to be at least from a parishioner perspective, of whom I'm aware. Men like C.J. Mahaney are the profiteers on the bankruptcy of intellectual appeasement. Men like C.J. can only thrive in an environment filled with weakness, uncertainty, self-doubt, and terror. He can only worm his way into intellectual leadership by passing off virtues as vice and turning vices into the highest moral achievement. The hallmark of such men is that they surround themselves with mediocrity, all the while pretending to surround themselves with the elite. And God help you if you ever challenge the mediocrity. I speak from experience. I want you to notice, as you observe these men, how they react to real achievement. Notice John MacArthur's denigration of those who run institutions and countries and universities, that it's somehow beneath their consideration. Notice how the new Calvinists thrive on making men small. Indeed, the hallmark of success in these circles is the race to see who can be the smallest, the humblest, the most self-deprecating. But do not be deceived. This is all theological fraud. It's a mask that they wear to cover their hideous souls. And here's how you rip off the mask. The moment they self-deprecate or self-abdicate, the moment they pay homage to inability or stupidity or moral corruption, agree with them. Say, you're right, you are stupid. You know nothing. You are weak. You are weak and impotent. You are morally corrupt. It is true. You are the personification of Augustine's original sin moral monster. And then step back and watch the fireworks. Watch how fast they defend their existence as smart and capable and important and, gasp, good. Watch how fast they defend their achievements and abilities and posture and strut and make pretense to being the world shapers and the humble masters of men. Why do you tolerate this? I've been talking for a little over 6 hours. And we've already got a little bit of hate mail about me because I'm arrogant. You won't. 6 hours I've been talking and people won't tolerate it. Yet these men speak with impunity. Why do you appease? So what is the real motive for the doctrines they preach? I'm going to tell you. This is a quote from Ayn Rand. Values are a necessity of any living organism's survival. Life is the process of self-sustaining, self-generated action. And the successful pursuit of values is a precondition of remaining alive. Since nature does not provide man with an automatic knowledge of the code of values he requires, there are differences in the codes which men accept and the goals they pursue. But consider the abstraction value, apart from the particular content of any given code, and ask yourself, what is the nature of a creature in which the sight of a value arouses hatred and the desire to destroy? The answer to her question is simple. All advocates of the Reformed construct are haters of man as such. They are perpetrators of the most disastrous body of thought ever perpetrated on human existence. And I tell you the truth, no matter their big alligator tears and their bromides to love and their endless cyber hugs and sundry discernment blogs and the love bombs when the new faces walk through the church doors, no matter the marketing and packaging, these people hold man in contempt. They are lovers of death. They are arch nihilists advocating doctrines that render man a living corpse. And this is who you give tacit approval to, by your silence, by your fear, by your appeasement. But they are coming for you. The goal of all determinists is to rule the world in their own image. And if you don't resist, you will get exactly what you deserve.